The morning sun painted the New Mexico territory in shades of gold and crimson as the most unlikely sight in the region's turbulent history unfolded in the dusty trading post of Cedar Ridge. A woman who stood nearly 7 feet tall, her Apache heritage evident in every graceful movement, gently lifted a man barely 4 feet in height onto the back of a magnificent stallion. Around them, 400 Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, slowly lowered their weapons and bowed their heads in a gesture of respect that would echo through the territories for generations to come. But this moment of impossible unity didn't happen overnight. It was the culmination of a journey that began with prejudice, suspicion, and the kind of cultural misunderstanding that had torn the American West apart for decades. Before we discover how a dwarf rancher and the tallest woman in Apache territory rewrote the rules of respect and alliance, we need to understand the extraordinary circumstances that brought them together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Cedar Ridge, nestled in the high desert of New Mexico territory, had never seen anything quite like Samuel "Sam" Harrison when he arrived in the spring of 1887. At 3 feet and 11 inches tall, Sam possessed the kind of presence that made people stop and stare, not out of mockery, but out of genuine curiosity about how someone of his stature could project such unmistakable authority and confidence. Sam Harrison had been born different, in a world that rarely celebrated difference. The son of a prosperous merchant family in Philadelphia, he had grown up understanding that his physical limitations would force him to develop capabilities that others took for granted. While his brothers learned to rely on physical intimidation and inherited social position, Sam had cultivated an intellect sharp enough to cut through deception and a moral clarity that made him formidable in ways that had nothing to do with height. His journey to the New Mexico territory hadn't been motivated by dreams of adventure or the pursuit of easy wealth that drew so many Easterners to the frontier. Sam had come west after a series of business conflicts in Philadelphia had revealed the ugly truth about how society treated those who didn't fit conventional expectations. Despite his proven success in commodity trading and his innovative approaches to logistics and supply chain management, his family's business partners had systematically excluded him from important decisions, treating him as an amusing novelty rather than a serious professional. The final insult had come during a board meeting where Sam had presented a comprehensive plan for expanding their shipping operations into the developing Western markets. His proposal was methodical, well-researched, and projected to generate substantial profits within 2 years. The other board members had listened politely, then proceeded to discuss his ideas as though he weren't present in the room, eventually crediting his innovations to his older brother Marcus, who had contributed nothing to the presentation beyond his imposing 6-foot frame. That evening, Sam had made a decision that would change not only his own life, but the lives of hundreds of people he had never met. He would take his share of the family inheritance, travel west, and prove that intelligence, determination, and integrity mattered more than physical appearance or social expectations. The frontier, with all its dangers and uncertainties, offered something that Philadelphia society never could: the possibility of being judged by what he could accomplish rather than how he looked accomplishing it. Cedar Ridge had seemed like an ideal location for Sam's ambitious plans. The town sat at the intersection of several major cattle trails, making it a natural hub for ranching operations throughout the region. More importantly, it was far enough from established Eastern social hierarchies to offer genuine opportunities for someone willing to work harder and think more strategically than his competitors. Sam's arrival had caused considerable discussion among Cedar Ridge's 300 residents. The town had seen its share of unusual characters during its brief existence: former Confederate soldiers seeking fresh starts, European immigrants fleeing political persecution, and adventurers drawn by rumors of silver strikes in the nearby mountains. But a dwarf businessman with obvious education and substantial financial resources was something entirely new. Mayor Robert Thompson, a practical man who measured visitors primarily by their potential contribution to local economic development, had welcomed Sam with cautious optimism. The town needed investment capital and business expertise to grow beyond its current status as a rough frontier settlement. If this unusual newcomer possessed both qualities, his physical stature was irrelevant to Thompson's calculations. "Mr. Harrison," Thompson had said during their first meeting, "I won't pretend that your appearance doesn't make you memorable in a place like Cedar Ridge, but if you're serious about establishing business operations here, you'll find this community more interested in results than appearances." Sam had appreciated the mayor's directness, understanding that frontier pragmatism offered advantages that Eastern politeness often concealed. Over the following weeks, he had systematically studied Cedar Ridge's economic foundations, transportation networks, and growth potential. What he discovered was a community perfectly positioned for expansion, but lacking the capital and strategic vision necessary to capitalize on its advantages. The region's cattle ranching operations were fragmented and inefficient, with individual ranchers struggling to compete against larger operations based in Texas and Colorado. Local businesses operated without coordination, missing opportunities for collective purchasing power and shared transportation costs. Most critically, the area's relationships with the Apache bands that controlled vast territories to the south remained tense and unpredictable, creating constant uncertainty that discouraged long-term investment. Sam's solution was characteristically comprehensive and innovative. Rather than competing with existing ranchers, he would create a cooperative system that allowed smaller operations to share resources, coordinate marketing efforts, and achieve economies of scale that individual ranchers couldn't match. His plan involved purchasing strategic parcels of land that would serve as central processing and distribution points, establishing contractual relationships with reliable buyers in eastern markets, and developing transportation systems that could move cattle and goods efficiently across the challenging terrain of the high desert. The plan's success depended on Sam's ability to convince established ranchers that cooperation would benefit everyone involved. This required not just financial incentives, but the kind of personal trust that could only be built through demonstrated competence and unwavering reliability. For a man of Sam's unusual appearance, earning that trust would require patience, strategic thinking, and the willingness to prove himself repeatedly in situations where others might be given the benefit of the doubt. Sam's first significant test came when he approached Jake Matthews, the owner of the largest ranch in the Cedar Ridge area. Matthews was a former cavalry officer who had established his operation using military precision and an authoritarian management style that brooked no interference from outsiders. His initial reaction to Sam's proposal was skeptical, bordering on dismissive. "No offense, Mr. Harrison," Matthews had said, his tone suggesting that offense was exactly what he intended. "But ranching is physical work that requires understanding animals, terrain, and weather patterns that you can't learn from books. This isn't a business you can manage from behind a desk in town." Sam's response had been to challenge Matthews to a practical demonstration of ranching knowledge. He proposed a week-long trial period during which he would work alongside Matthews' regular crew, contributing to daily operations while learning the specific challenges of high desert ranching. If he proved incapable of meaningful contribution, he would withdraw his proposal and seek opportunities elsewhere. If he demonstrated competence, Matthews would seriously consider the cooperative arrangement. The week that followed became legendary among Cedar Ridge's ranching community. Sam had prepared for the challenge by studying everything he could find about cattle behavior, range management, and desert survival techniques. More importantly, he had spent weeks developing modified equipment and techniques that would allow him to perform ranching tasks effectively despite his physical limitations. Sam's custom-designed saddle allowed him to mount and control horses with the same efficiency as taller riders. His modified lasso techniques compensated for his shorter reach while actually providing better leverage for controlling cattle in certain situations. Most impressively, his systematic approach to range management revealed inefficiencies in Matthews' operations that could be corrected through better planning and resource allocation. By the end of the trial week, Matthews had gained not just respect for Sam's capabilities, but genuine appreciation for his innovative approaches to traditional ranching challenges. The former cavalry officer's military background had taught him to value competence over appearance, and Sam's performance had been undeniably competent. "Mr. Harrison," Matthews admitted during their final evaluation meeting, "I've been ranching for 15 years, and you've shown me techniques I never considered. Your cooperative proposal deserves serious consideration, not because I'm doing you a favor, but because it could benefit all of us." Sam's success with Matthews opened doors throughout the Cedar Ridge ranching community. Word spread quickly about the dwarf businessman who could outthink veteran ranchers and solve problems that had frustrated the region for years. Within 3 months, Sam had signed cooperative agreements with 8 ranching operations, creating a network that controlled over 50,000 acres of prime grazing land. The economic benefits of cooperation became apparent almost immediately. Collective purchasing reduced feed costs by 20%. Coordinated transportation cut shipping expenses by even larger margins. Most importantly, the cooperative's size and organization allowed them to negotiate better prices with Eastern buyers who preferred dealing with reliable, large-scale suppliers rather than unpredictable individual ranchers. But Sam's greatest challenge still lay ahead. The cooperative's expansion plans required access to water rights and grazing areas that lay within territories controlled by Apache bands led by chiefs who had little reason to trust any white businessman, regardless of his good intentions. The history of broken treaties, violent conflicts, and cultural misunderstanding between Apache peoples and American settlers created barriers that no amount of business acumen could easily overcome. Sam understood that success would require not just negotiation skills, but genuine respect for Apache culture and the wisdom to approach potential partnerships with humility, rather than the arrogance that had characterized most white interactions with native peoples. He would need to prove that cooperation could benefit both communities without requiring either side to abandon their fundamental values or cultural identity. This realization led Sam to begin studying Apache languages, customs, and political structures with the same methodical intensity he had brought to learning ranching techniques. He sought out traders, former military scouts, and anyone else who could provide insights into Apache perspectives on land use, resource sharing, and the complex protocols that governed diplomatic interactions between different tribal groups. What Sam discovered was a sophisticated civilization with its own concepts of honor, justice, and mutual obligation that bore little resemblance to the savage stereotypes promoted by Eastern newspapers and popular fiction. The Apache peoples had developed sustainable relationships with the harsh desert environment through generations of careful observation and adaptation. Their military capabilities had earned the respect of professional soldiers throughout the American West, but their diplomatic traditions emphasized consensus building and long-term relationship management over short-term advantage. Most importantly, Sam learned that Apache culture placed enormous value on personal courage, individual competence, and the kind of direct communication that avoided deception or manipulation. These were qualities that Sam possessed in abundance, though he would need to find ways to demonstrate them that transcended the cultural barriers separating his world from theirs. The opportunity for that demonstration would come sooner than Sam expected, arriving in the form of a crisis that would test not just his business skills, but his character in ways that would determine the future of everyone in the Cedar Ridge region. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Apache raid that struck the Morrison Ranch on a moonless October night in 1887 shattered the fragile peace that had existed between Cedar Ridge and the surrounding tribal territories. When dawn broke over the high desert, 3 cowboys lay dead. 50 head of prime cattle had vanished into the wilderness, and the delicate balance of power that governed the region had shifted dramatically toward open warfare. Thomas Morrison, a hot-tempered rancher who had consistently opposed Sam Harrison's cooperative approach, rode into Cedar Ridge that morning with blood in his eyes and vengeance on his mind. His horse was lathered with sweat from the desperate ride, and Morrison himself bore the wild look of a man who had watched his life's work disappear into the darkness. This is what comes of treating savages like civilized people, Morrison shouted as he burst into the town's main saloon, where most of Cedar Ridge's business leaders gathered each morning to discuss the day's priorities. While Harrison's been talking about cooperation and mutual benefit, the Apache have been planning to steal everything we've worked to build. The accusation hung in the air like gunpowder smoke, carrying implications that went far beyond the immediate crisis. Morrison was suggesting that Sam's efforts to establish peaceful relationships with Apache bands had somehow encouraged or enabled the raid. In a frontier community where survival often depended on clear distinctions between friend and enemy, such accusations could destroy reputations and end careers with devastating finality. Mayor Thompson raised his hand for silence, understanding that inflammatory rhetoric could quickly escalate into violence that would serve no one's interests. Tom, we're all sorry about your losses, but let's stick to facts. What exactly happened at your place last night? Morrison's account painted a picture of professional military precision that surprised everyone who heard it. The raiders had approached his ranch buildings under cover of darkness, moving with the kind of coordinated stealth that suggested extensive planning and reconnaissance. They had neutralized his guard dogs without raising an alarm, cut his telephone lines to prevent calls for help, and systematically gathered his best cattle before disappearing into terrain that would make pursuit virtually impossible. More disturbing than the raid's execution was its apparent motivation. The Apache had taken only the highest quality breeding stock, leaving behind older animals and steers that would have been easier to move quickly. This suggested they weren't simply seeking food or immediate resources, but implementing a strategic plan designed to cripple Morrison's long-term ranching operations. They knew exactly what they were looking for, Morrison continued, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and grudging respect for his adversary's competence. This wasn't some desperate band looking for easy targets. These were warriors following orders from someone who understands ranching well enough to know which animals would hurt us most to lose. Jake Matthews, who had become one of Sam's strongest supporters within the cooperative, asked the question that was troubling everyone in the room. Tom, had you been negotiating with any Apache representatives? Were there any disputes about grazing rights or water access that might have triggered this response? Morrison's face darkened at the implication that his own actions might have contributed to the raid. I don't negotiate with thieves and murderers, Jake. Unlike some people in this room, I believe the only language these savages understand is force. Maybe if we'd been spending less time on Harrison's cooperation fantasies and more time on proper defenses, my boys would still be alive. The meeting that followed revealed deep divisions within Cedar Ridge's community about how to respond to the crisis. Morrison and his supporters demanded immediate military action, arguing that only overwhelming force could deter future raids and restore security to the region's ranching operations. They wanted to petition the territorial government for cavalry support and organize civilian militias to patrol the boundaries between white settlements and Apache territories. Sam Harrison found himself in an impossible position. His cooperative agreements with local ranchers had made him a central figure in the community's economic development, but his advocacy for peaceful coexistence with Apache peoples now made him a target for blame and suspicion. Several ranchers, who had initially supported his cooperative approach, were beginning to question whether accommodation with hostile tribes was practical or even morally defensible. The debate continued for hours, with emotions running higher as details of the raid became more widely known. Morrison's 3 dead cowboys had been popular figures in Cedar Ridge, young men who had families and friends throughout the community. Their deaths transformed an economic dispute into a personal tragedy that demanded some form of justice or retribution. But Sam had spent months studying Apache culture and political structures, and Morrison's description of the raid troubled him for reasons that had nothing to do with its immediate impact on local ranching operations. Professional military precision, strategic target selection, and apparent inside knowledge of ranch operations suggested something far more complex than simple tribal raiding. "Mayor Thompson," Sam interrupted during a particularly heated exchange between Morrison and Matthews, "I'd like permission to investigate this situation before we commit to any specific course of action. Something about this raid doesn't fit the patterns of Apache military behavior that I've been studying." Morrison's response was immediate and scathing. "What would a city boy who's been here 6 months know about Apache behavior? You've been reading books and talking to traders while the rest of us have been trying to build something in this wilderness. Now good men are dead because we listened to your theories about peaceful coexistence." The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth that Sam couldn't easily dismiss. He was indeed an outsider whose knowledge of Apache culture came primarily from research rather than direct experience. His advocacy for cooperation over confrontation had influenced community policies that might have contributed to the ranch's vulnerability. If his approach had somehow enabled the tragedy, he bore responsibility that no amount of good intentions could erase. But Sam's analytical mind had detected inconsistencies in Morrison's account that suggested the real situation was more complicated than anyone realized. Apache raiding parties typically operated with smaller numbers and focused on mobility over precision. They rarely killed unless directly threatened, preferring to avoid actions that would provoke massive military retaliation. Most importantly, the kind of detailed intelligence about ranch operations that the raid demonstrated would have required extensive reconnaissance that someone should have noticed. "Tom," Sam said carefully, "I'm not questioning your account of what happened, but I am wondering about how the raiders knew so much about your operation. You said they took only your best breeding stock and avoided the animals that would have been easier to move. That suggests someone with detailed knowledge of your herd composition and ranch layout." The implication was clear, though Sam was careful not to state it directly. The raid's precision suggested inside information that could only have come from someone familiar with Morrison's operations. This might mean collaboration with disgruntled employees, intelligence gathering by Apache scouts who had observed the ranch over extended periods, or even deliberate misdirection designed to make Apache bands appear responsible for actions planned and executed by others. Mayor Thompson recognized the importance of Sam's observations, understanding that hasty military action based on incorrect assumptions could trigger conflicts that would devastate the entire region. "Mr. Harrison, what kind of investigation are you proposing? We need to respond to this crisis quickly, but we also need to make sure we're responding to the right threat." Sam's proposal was characteristically methodical and comprehensive. He wanted to examine the physical evidence at Morrison's ranch, interview survivors and witnesses, and consult with Apache traders who maintained relationships with various tribal bands. Most importantly, he wanted to determine whether the raid represented an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern that might indicate coordinated hostility from multiple Apache groups. If this was an official action authorized by Apache leadership, Sam explained, then we need to understand their motivations and explore diplomatic solutions before the situation escalates into open warfare. If it was unauthorized raiding by rogue elements, then we need to work with tribal authorities to address the problem through their own justice systems. But if it was designed to appear like Apache work while actually being carried out by others, then our real enemies are still among us. The suggestion that the raid might have been a false flag operation designed to blame Apache bands for crimes committed by others was so unexpected that it took several moments for its implications to sink in. If Sam was correct, then military action against Apache territories would not only fail to address the real threat, but would likely trigger the very conflicts that the actual perpetrators hoped to achieve. Morrison's reaction was explosive. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Are you seriously suggesting that my own people killed my cowboys and stole my cattle just to make the Apache look bad? What possible reason would anyone have for doing such a thing?" Sam's answer revealed the depth of analysis he had been conducting into the region's economic and political dynamics. Several groups had strong incentives to disrupt the peaceful coexistence that his cooperative was helping to establish between white ranchers and Apache bands. Competing business interests from Texas and Colorado saw the Cedar Ridge Cooperative as a threat to their market dominance. Political figures seeking to advance their careers through military action against Native peoples needed incidents that would justify federal intervention. Most cynically, certain elements within the territorial government had financial interests in conflicts that would open Apache lands to white settlement and resource extraction. "Tom," Sam said gently, "I'm not accusing anyone specific of wrongdoing, but we need to consider all possibilities before we make decisions that could cost more lives. Let me examine the evidence and consult with people who understand Apache military customs. If I'm wrong about this being a false flag operation, then at least we'll have confirmed that we're dealing with a genuine Apache threat. But if I'm right, then responding with military force would give our real enemies exactly what they're hoping to achieve." The debate continued throughout the day, with community sentiment gradually shifting towards Sam's cautious approach as people realized the potentially catastrophic consequences of mistaken military action. Even Morrison, despite his grief and anger, began to acknowledge that precipitous revenge might not serve his own long-term interests if it triggered conflicts that would make ranching in the region impossible. By evening, Mayor Thompson had authorized Sam's investigation while also beginning preparations for defensive measures that could protect local ranches without immediately escalating toward open warfare. It was a compromise solution that satisfied no one completely but offered the possibility of avoiding disasters that could destroy everything the community had worked to build. As Sam prepared to begin his investigation the following morning, he understood that his entire future in Cedar Ridge, and possibly the future of peaceful coexistence between white and Apache communities throughout the region, depended on his ability to uncover the truth about Morrison's raid. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean not just personal humiliation, but potentially the deaths of hundreds of people on both sides of a conflict that might be entirely based on deception. Sam Harrison's investigation into the Morrison Ranch raid began at dawn the following morning, when the high desert air still carried the chill of night, and the tracks left by the raiders remained clearly visible in the hard-packed earth. What he discovered during the next 3 days would shake his faith in everything he thought he understood about frontier justice, community loyalty. The physical evidence at Morrison's ranch told a story that contradicted almost every detail of the conventional narrative about Apache raiding tactics. Sam had spent weeks studying accounts of genuine Apache military operations, and the patterns he observed at the crime scene bore little resemblance to the documented behavior of tribal war parties. Apache raiders typically moved on foot or with minimal horses, prioritizing speed and stealth over the systematic gathering of large numbers of cattle. The tracks surrounding Morrison's ranch showed evidence of at least 20 mounted men with pack animals sufficient to move 50 head of cattle across difficult terrain. This represented a logistical operation that would have required extensive planning and resources far beyond what most Apache bands could readily deploy. More troubling were the details of how the attack had been executed. Apache warriors were legendary for their ability to move through hostile territory without leaving obvious signs of their passage. Yet the raiders who had struck Morrison's ranch had left clear evidence of their route, almost as though they wanted to be followed. Boot prints around the ranch buildings showed a mixture of military issue, cavalry boots and civilian footwear that would have been unusual for a traditional Apache war party. Sam's most significant discovery came when he examined the bodies of Morrison's 3 dead cowboys. All 3 men had been killed with bullets rather than the traditional Apache weapons like bows, lances, or knives. The wounds were consistent with military-issue ammunition fired from standard cavalry carbines. While Apache bands had certainly acquired firearms through various means, they typically preferred to conserve ammunition for critical situations, rather than using it for raids where traditional weapons would have been equally effective. But it was the testimony of Maria Santos, Morrison's Mexican cook, who had hidden in the root cellar during the attack, that provided Sam with the most damaging evidence against the official version of events. Maria had observed the raiders more closely than anyone else, and her account contained details that Morrison had either overlooked or deliberately omitted from his public statements. "Senator Harrison," Maria whispered during their private conversation, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. "Some of those men, they were not Apache. I saw their faces in the moonlight when they passed near the kitchen window. 2 of them were white men, and they spoke English to each other, not in any tribal language." The revelation that the raiding party had included white participants transformed Sam's investigation from a routine examination of Apache military tactics into something far more dangerous. If Maria's observations were accurate, then the attack on Morrison's ranch represented a sophisticated deception operation designed to trigger military action against Apache territories while concealing the true identity of the perpetrators. Sam pressed Maria for additional details about what she had observed, understanding that her testimony might be the key to preventing a catastrophic escalation toward open warfare. The cook described overhearing fragments of conversation that suggested the raiders were following a predetermined plan rather than making tactical decisions based on immediate circumstances. Most significantly, she had heard one of the white men refer to the schedule and the importance of making it look authentic. "They knew exactly where to find the best cattle," Maria continued, "like someone had told them which animals to take and which ones to leave behind, and they were very careful not to damage the ranch buildings or steal anything that couldn't be easily moved. It was like they wanted to hurt Senator Morrison's business without destroying his property completely." Sam's analytical mind immediately grasped the implications of Maria's observations. The raiders' behavior suggested they were operating according to instructions from someone with detailed knowledge of ranching economics and territorial politics. Taking breeding stock would cripple Morrison's long-term operations, while leaving him with sufficient remaining assets to rebuild. Exactly the kind of calculated damage that might be inflicted by business competitors seeking to eliminate rivals, without triggering excessive attention from territorial authorities. But proving Maria's allegations would require more than her testimony alone. Sam needed additional evidence that could withstand the intense scrutiny that would follow any accusations of false flag operations. The stakes were too high for speculation or circumstantial evidence. He needed documentation or witnesses that could establish a clear pattern of deception. Sam's next investigation target was the trail left by the stolen cattle, which according to Morrison led directly toward known Apache territories in the southern mountains. Following this trail on horseback, Sam made his first direct contact with Apache scouts who had been monitoring the situation with their own concerns about potential military retaliation. The scout who approached Sam was a young warrior named Joseph Crowfeather, whose English was excellent and whose understanding of white political dynamics was sophisticated enough to appreciate the dangerous implications of the recent raid. Crowfeather's band was one of several that maintained peaceful relationships with traders and settlers in the Cedar Ridge region, and they had as much to lose from open warfare as anyone in the white community. "Small Chief," Crowfeather said, using the respectful nickname that Apache traders had adopted for Sam based on his stature and obvious authority. "My people did not take Morrison's cattle. We know of this raid, but it was not done by any band that follows the counsel of our elders." The Apache scouts' denial was significant because it came from someone whose reputation for honesty was well established among traders throughout the region. Crowfeather had served as an intermediary in several previous disputes between Apache bands and white settlers, and his word carried weight with both communities. More importantly, he offered to provide evidence that would support his claims about Apache non-involvement in the Morrison raid. "The men who took those cattle," Crowfeather explained, "they did not move like Apache warriors. They made too much noise, left too many signs, and traveled during times when our people would remain hidden. Someone taught them to follow Apache trails, but they did not learn the Apache way of thinking about the land and the animals." Crowfeather's observations matched Sam's own analysis of the physical evidence, but the scout had additional information that provided crucial insights into the raiders' true identity and motivations. Apache watchers stationed throughout the region had observed unusual activity during the weeks preceding the Morrison raid, including meetings between unknown white men and certain individuals who were known to have conflicts with the cooperative ranching movement that Sam had been developing. "There's a white man named Carson Blake," Crowfeather continued, "who has been asking questions about your cattle business and offering money to anyone who can provide information about ranch operations in this area. He claims to represent buyers from Texas, but he asks questions that buyers would not need to know." Carson Blake was a name that Sam recognized from his research into regional business competition. Blake operated as a freelance broker who arranged cattle purchases for large ranching operations based in Texas and Colorado. His business model depended on maintaining artificially low prices for cattle purchased from smaller ranchers who lacked the market knowledge and negotiating power to demand fair compensation for their livestock. Sam's cooperative was threatening Blake's business model by providing Cedar Ridge ranchers with better market information, collective bargaining power, and direct access to Eastern buyers who paid premium prices for high-quality cattle. If the cooperative continued to expand, Blake and the large ranching interests he represented would lose access to the cheap cattle that formed the foundation of their profit margins. The possibility that Blake might be orchestrating false flag operations to destroy the cooperative represented exactly the kind of sophisticated business warfare that Sam had encountered during his years in Philadelphia. But proving such allegations would require evidence that could withstand legal scrutiny and political pressure from interests that extended far beyond the New Mexico territory. Sam's investigation took an unexpected turn when he decided to examine the financial records of several businesses that had been competing with the Cedar Ridge Cooperative. Using contacts he had developed during his years in commodity trading, Sam was able to access banking information that revealed unusual financial activity in the weeks surrounding the Morrison raid. Carson Blake had received a substantial payment from a consortium of Texas ranchers just 2 days before the raid occurred. The payment was officially described as an advance for future cattle purchases, but its timing and amount suggested it might have been compensation for services rather than a legitimate business transaction. More significantly, Blake had immediately used a portion of this money to hire several men whose backgrounds included military service and experience with livestock handling. The financial trail led Sam to a shocking discovery about the true scope of the conspiracy against his cooperative. The Morrison raid was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated campaign designed to destabilize peaceful relationships between white settlers and Apache bands throughout the region. Similar false flag operations were being planned for other areas, where cooperative ranching movements were threatening established business interests. Documents that Sam obtained through his banking contacts revealed that the conspiracy extended to territorial political figures who had their own reasons for encouraging conflicts with Apache peoples. Military action against tribal territories would open vast areas of land for white settlement and resource extraction, creating opportunities for profit that far exceeded anything that could be earned through legitimate business competition. But Sam's most disturbing discovery concerned Morrison himself, whose role in the conspiracy was far more complex than anyone had realized. Financial records showed that Morrison had received payments from Blake's consortium in the months before the raid, ostensibly for providing information about cooperative operations and Apache trade relationships. While Morrison's 3 dead cowboys were genuine victims of the false flag operation, Morrison himself appeared to have been a willing participant in planning the attack that had killed his own employees. The revelation of Morrison's involvement transformed Sam's understanding of the entire situation. The man who had been demanding military retaliation against Apache bands had actually participated in planning the attack that he was using to justify such action. His grief and anger were real, but they stemmed from a conspiracy that had spiraled beyond his control rather than from unprovoked Apache aggression. Armed with this evidence, Sam faced the most difficult decision of his life. Exposing the conspiracy would prevent unjustified military action against Apache territories, but it would also reveal corruption that extended throughout the territorial business and political establishment. The people responsible for the conspiracy had resources and connections that could destroy not just Sam's business operations, but potentially his life. As Sam prepared to return to Cedar Ridge with evidence that would shatter the community's understanding of recent events, he knew that his next actions would determine whether justice or deception would shape the future of the American West in this corner of New Mexico territory. Sam Harrison's return to Cedar Ridge with evidence of the conspiracy created a crisis that threatened to tear the community apart. The revelation that Morrison had participated in planning the attack that killed his own employees sent shockwaves through a frontier town where trust between neighbors often meant the difference between survival and catastrophe. Mayor Thompson convened an emergency meeting in the town hall, but the atmosphere was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had experienced. During its brief existence, armed men lined the walls, their allegiances unclear as accusations and counter-accusations flew between supporters of different versions of recent events. The evidence Sam had gathered was compelling, but it challenged fundamental assumptions about loyalty, justice, and community solidarity that many residents were unwilling to abandon. Morrison sat in the front row, his face a mask of defiant rage as Sam methodically presented the financial records, witness testimony, and physical evidence that exposed the false flag operation. The man who had demanded military vengeance against Apache bands now found himself accused of participating in a conspiracy that had cost 3 lives while threatening to trigger a regional war. These are lies fabricated by a man who's been collaborating with savages from the day he arrived in our community, Morrison shouted when Sam finished his presentation. Harrison's been planning to hand our lands over to the Apache all along, and now he's using forged documents to destroy anyone who stands in his way. The accusation was serious enough to give pause to several community members who had been inclined to believe Sam's evidence. In frontier communities where paranoia about external threats was a constant factor in daily life, suggestions of treachery by outsiders carried weight that went beyond simple logic or evidence. Morrison was a known quantity whose family had been among Cedar Ridge's original settlers, while Sam remained a newcomer whose unusual appearance and Eastern background made him inherently suspect to some residents. But Jake Matthews, the former cavalry officer whose support had been crucial to Sam's early success, stepped forward to defend the investigation's credibility. Matthews had spent years evaluating evidence in military contexts where mistakes could cost lives, and his analysis of Sam's documentation was thorough and uncompromising. "Tom," Matthews said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure, "I've examined every piece of evidence that Sam collected, and I've verified the financial records through my own banking contacts. The documentation is authentic, and the pattern of payments to Carson Blake corresponds exactly with the timeline of events surrounding the raid on your ranch." Matthews' endorsement of Sam's investigation carried enormous weight within the community, but it also created new tensions as residents were forced to choose between competing versions of events that couldn't both be true. Several of Morrison's supporters began demanding additional evidence, while others suggested that the entire controversy was a distraction from the more important task of defending the community against future Apache attacks. The debate might have continued indefinitely if not for the unexpected arrival of Carson Blake himself, who had apparently decided that direct confrontation was preferable to allowing Sam's accusations to go unchallenged. Blake rode into Cedar Ridge, accompanied by 6 heavily armed men whose military bearing and professional equipment suggested they were more than simple ranch hands or cattle buyers. Blake's appearance in Cedar Ridge was calculated to intimidate anyone who might be considering support for Sam's version of events. The cattle broker was a large, imposing man whose reputation for violence was well established throughout the territorial ranching community. His armed companions positioned themselves strategically around the town hall, creating an atmosphere of barely contained menace that made clear the potential consequences of continued investigation into the conspiracy. "I understand there's been some confusion about recent events in your community," Blake announced as he entered the town hall, his voice carrying the casual confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than persuasion. "I'm here to clear up any misunderstandings and to discuss business opportunities that could benefit everyone involved." Blake's business opportunities were actually ultimatums disguised as generous offers. He proposed to purchase the entire Cedar Ridge Cooperative at prices that were substantially below market value, claiming that recent Apache hostilities had made the region too dangerous for continued ranching operations. Families who accepted his offers would receive safe passage to more secure territories, while those who refused would be left to face the consequences of their poor judgment. "The Apache situation is going to get much worse before it gets better," Blake explained with the tone of someone delivering a weather forecast rather than a threat. "The territorial government is planning major military operations that will make this entire region unsuitable for civilian ranching. Smart folks will take my offers and relocate before things get really unpleasant." The implications of Blake's statements were clear to everyone in the room. The conspiracy extended beyond simple business competition to include coordination with territorial political figures who were planning to use manufactured Apache conflicts as justification for land seizures and military campaigns. The false flag operations were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic effort to clear native peoples from territories that contained valuable resources or strategic advantages. Sam realized that exposing Morrison's participation in the conspiracy had forced Blake to reveal the broader scope of his operations, but it had also escalated the situation beyond anything that could be resolved through local community action. The forces arrayed against the Cedar Ridge Cooperative included business interests with connections to territorial and federal political figures who had the power to destroy entire communities that interfered with their plans. But Sam's investigation had also attracted attention from unexpected allies whose own interests were threatened by Blake's conspiracy. Dr. Elizabeth Whitman, a physician who had recently established a practice in nearby Las Cruces, had been tracking similar false flag operations throughout the territory as part of her work documenting violence against Native peoples for Eastern Reform Organizations. Dr. Whitman arrived in Cedar Ridge just hours after Blake, bringing with her documentation that confirmed Sam's analysis while providing additional evidence of the conspiracy's scope and organization. Her presence transformed the local controversy into something with regional and potentially national implications for federal Indian policy and territorial development. Mr. Harrison's investigation has uncovered evidence of a systematic campaign to manufacture conflicts between white settlers and Apache peoples throughout New Mexico territory, Dr. Whitman announced to the gathered community. The goal is to justify military action that will clear Native peoples from lands that certain business interests want to control for mining and railroad development. Dr. Whitman's documentation included correspondence between Blake's consortium and territorial officials that revealed the conspiracy's ultimate objectives. The false flag operations were designed to create public support for military campaigns that would force Apache bands onto reservations, opening vast territories for white settlement and resource extraction. The economic value of these lands far exceeded anything that could be earned through legitimate ranching or cattle trading. Revelation that their local crisis was connected to territorial and federal political conflicts created a new dynamic. Within the Cedar Ridge community, some residents became more determined to resist Blake's pressure, understanding that surrender would make them complicit in a systematic campaign of deception and violence against Native peoples. Others became more frightened, recognizing that opposition to such powerful interests could result in consequences that extended far beyond economic hardship. Morrison, faced with irrefutable evidence of his own involvement in the conspiracy, made a desperate attempt to shift blame entirely onto Blake and his consortium. He claimed to have been deceived about the true nature of the false flag operation, insisting that he had believed it would be a harmless demonstration designed to convince Apache bands to negotiate more seriously about territorial boundaries and resource access. "I never intended for anyone to be killed," Morrison protested, his voice breaking with what might have been genuine remorse or calculated performance. "Blake told me it would just be a cattle theft that would make the Apache realize they needed to come to the negotiating table. I had no idea he was planning to murder my own employees." Morrison's attempted defense revealed the complexity of moral responsibility within the conspiracy. While he had clearly participated in planning the false flag operation, his level of knowledge about its violent aspects remained unclear. Blake and his consortium had apparently compartmentalized information to ensure that local participants, like Morrison, could be portrayed as naive dupes rather than willing accomplices if the conspiracy was exposed. But Dr. Whitman's documentation suggested that Morrison's claims of innocence were at best partially true. Correspondence between Morrison and Blake's agents included discussions of the need to make the false flag operation convincing enough to justify military response, which implied awareness that violence might be necessary to achieve their objectives. The complexity of Morrison's role in the conspiracy reflected broader questions about how ordinary people became complicit in systematic injustice. Morrison was not inherently evil, but his combination of economic desperation, racial prejudice, and susceptibility to manipulation had made him a willing tool for interests that viewed both white settlers and Native peoples as expendable resources. In pursuit of profit and political power. As the confrontation in the town hall continued through the afternoon, it became clear that Cedar Ridge was facing a choice that would define its character for generations to come. The community could accept Blake's ultimatums and become complicit in the destruction of Apache peoples and their own democratic institutions, or they could resist and face the consequences of opposing forces with vast resources and few moral constraints. Sam understood that his investigation had created this crisis, But he also recognized that the choice facing Cedar Ridge reflected broader questions about the moral foundations of American expansion into territories inhabited by native peoples. The decisions made in this small frontier community would either contribute to a pattern of deception and violence that was reshaping the American West, or demonstrate that ordinary people could choose justice over convenience when confronted with evidence of systematic wrongdoing. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome would determine not just the future of Cedar Ridge, but Sam's own understanding of whether his faith in human decency and democratic institutions was justified or tragically naive. The standoff between Blake's armed men and the Cedar Ridge community reached a critical turning point when Apache scouts appeared on the ridge surrounding the town. Joseph Crow Feather had returned with a delegation of tribal elders, whose presence transformed the local conflict into something with far broader implications for territorial peace and justice. Chief Running Bear, an elderly Apache leader whose reputation for wisdom was respected throughout the region, rode into Cedar Ridge at the head of a party that included warriors, women, and children. Their arrival was unprecedented in the town's history. Never before had Apache peoples entered the settlement in such numbers or with such obvious peaceful intentions. The presence of Apache families, particularly the children, served as a powerful statement about the delegation's purpose. Warrior parties traveled light and fast, but this group had brought their most vulnerable members as evidence of their commitment to diplomatic rather than military solutions to the crisis. It was a gesture of trust that few white communities had ever received from Apache peoples. Chief Running Bear dismounted in the town square and approached the town hall with the measured dignity of someone whose authority derived from decades of successful leadership through impossible circumstances. At his side walked a woman whose extraordinary height made her visible above the crowd of both Apache and white observers who had gathered to witness this historic encounter. Sarah Tall Eagle stood 6 feet and 11 inches in her moccasins, making her the tallest person anyone in Cedar Ridge had ever seen. But her physical stature was only the most obvious manifestation of her remarkable presence. At 28 years old, she served as one of Chief Running Bear's principal advisors and had earned a reputation throughout Apache territories for her intelligence, diplomatic skill, and unwavering commitment to protecting her people's interests through negotiation rather than warfare. Sarah's role in the delegation went beyond translation or ceremonial function. She was recognized throughout Apache lands as someone whose judgment about white intentions and character was rarely wrong. Her presence in Cedar Ridge represented a level of Apache investment in peaceful resolution that exceeded anything the community had dared to hope for during the current crisis. "Small Chief," Chief Running Bear said in careful English as he approached Sam, using the respectful title that had spread throughout Apache communities based on reports from traders and scouts. "We have come to speak truth about the cattle theft and the dead men. Our people did not commit these crimes, but we understand that some among your people believe we are responsible." The Apache delegation's arrival had an immediate impact on the dynamics within the town hall. Blake's armed men found themselves significantly outnumbered and surrounded by Apache warriors whose military capabilities were legendary throughout the territorial army. More importantly, the presence of respected Apache leaders transformed the controversy from a simple dispute about local events into a formal diplomatic negotiation with implications for peace throughout the region. Dr. Whitman seized the opportunity to present her documentation of the conspiracy to Chief Running Bear and his advisors, understanding that Apache leaders needed to understand the full scope of the threats they faced from Blake's consortium and its territorial political allies. The evidence she had gathered provided confirmation of what many Apache leaders had suspected, that recent provocations were part of a coordinated campaign to justify military action against tribal territories. Sarah Tall Eagle studied Dr. Whitman's documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that her people's survival might depend on accurately assessing white political intentions. Her ability to read English was exceptional for someone who had grown up in traditional Apache communities, reflecting years of study with missionary teachers and traders who had taught her to navigate the complex world of American law and politics. This evidence shows that those who would make war against our people are willing to kill their own kind to achieve their purposes, Sarah observed after examining the financial records and correspondence that documented Blake's conspiracy. Such men cannot be trusted to honor any agreements or respect any boundaries. They will continue their deceptions until they are stopped by force or justice. Chief Running Bear nodded gravely at Sarah's analysis, understanding that the false flag operations represented a new level of threat that required careful response. Traditional Apache military tactics were designed to counter conventional enemies, who fought according to recognizable patterns and objectives. But opponents who were willing to murder their own people while blaming Apache bands for their crimes represented a level of deception that required different strategies. "Small Chief," the Apache leader said to Sam, "your investigation has revealed truth that protects both our peoples from those who would profit from our destruction. But knowing truth and acting upon it are different challenges. What do you propose that we do with this knowledge?" Sam's response would determine not only his own credibility with Apache leaders, but the future relationship between Cedar Ridge and the tribal communities that controlled vast territories throughout the region. He understood that Chief Running Bear was testing his commitment to justice and his willingness to take risks in support of principles he claimed to believe. "Chief Running Bear," Sam replied carefully, "I believe we must work together to expose this conspiracy to territorial authorities who have the power to stop it. But I also understand that my people have given your people little reason to trust promises from white officials. I am willing to stake my own reputation and safety on ensuring that justice is done." The offer was significant because it represented something Apache leaders rarely received from white negotiators: a personal guarantee, backed by stakes that the guarantor valued more than temporary convenience or political advantage. Sam was proposing to become personally responsible for ensuring that the conspiracy was properly investigated and its perpetrators held accountable according to American law. But Chief Running Bear's response revealed the complexity of Apache perspectives on American justice systems. "Small Chief, your heart speaks truth, but your government's laws have not protected our people in the past. Those who make war against us claim to follow the same laws that you say will bring justice. Why should we believe that this time will be different?" The question forced Sam to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of American legal institutions when dealing with systematic injustice against Native peoples. Even if Blake's conspiracy was exposed and prosecuted, the underlying economic and political forces that had created it would continue operating through other channels and different methods. Legal victory might prevent immediate military action against Apache territories, but it wouldn't address the fundamental conflicts over land, resources, and sovereignty that made such conspiracies profitable. Sarah Tall Eagle stepped forward with a proposal that would test both Sam's character and the Cedar Ridge community's commitment to genuine cooperation with Apache peoples. Rather than relying on distant territorial authorities whose trustworthiness was questionable, she suggested creating a joint Apache white investigation team that would gather additional evidence and present it simultaneously to both American officials and Apache councils. "If Small Chief truly believes in justice for all peoples," Sarah said, her impressive height allowing her to address the entire gathering with natural authority, "then he will be willing to place himself under Apache protection while we work together to expose these lies. Our warriors will guarantee his safety, but he must be willing to live among our people and follow our customs while the investigation continues." The proposal was unprecedented in the history of Apache-white relations in the territory. Sarah was suggesting that Sam leave the security of his own community and place himself entirely under Apache protection while they collaborated on gathering evidence that could prevent regional warfare. It was both an offer of alliance and a test of Sam's willingness to trust Apache peoples with his life. Blake's reaction to Sarah's proposal was immediate and violent. "That's the most ridiculous suggestion I've ever heard," he shouted, his composure finally cracking under the pressure of seeing his carefully orchestrated conspiracy unraveling before his eyes. No civilized man would place himself at the mercy of savages, regardless of what promises they make. But Blake's outburst revealed something that had been hidden beneath his diplomatic facade. His reference to Apache peoples as savages, and his assumption that cooperation with them was inherently impossible, exposed the racial hatred that motivated his conspiracy beyond simple economic calculation. Blake wasn't just seeking profit from territorial conflicts. He was committed to the destruction of Apache communities as a moral imperative that justified any level of deception or violence. Sarah's response to Blake's insult was delivered with the kind of controlled dignity that made his crude prejudice appear even more contemptible by comparison. "The savage is the one who kills innocent people to blame others for his crimes," she said, her voice carrying throughout the town hall with perfect clarity. "We judge men by their actions, not their words or their appearance." The contrast between Blake's crude racism and Sarah's articulate dignity had a powerful impact on the white residents of Cedar Ridge, who were observing this unprecedented diplomatic encounter. Many of them had never heard Apache people speak English or witnessed their sophisticated understanding of complex political and moral issues. The stereotypes promoted by territorial newspapers and popular fiction were being challenged by direct evidence of Apache intelligence and character. Mayor Thompson recognized that the community was witnessing a historic moment that would define Cedar Ridge's future relationship with Apache peoples throughout the region. The choice facing the town was no longer simply about supporting or opposing Sam's investigation, but about whether they would embrace genuine cooperation with Native communities or remain trapped in the patterns of deception and violence that Blake's conspiracy represented. "Mr. Harrison," Thompson said formally, understanding that his words would be remembered by both communities for generations to come, "the town of Cedar Ridge supports your investigation and your cooperation with Chief Running Bear's delegation. We believe that truth and justice serve everyone's interests better than deception and warfare." Sam's acceptance of Sarah's proposal sent ripples of shock and admiration through both the white and Apache observers. By agreeing to place himself under Apache protection, he was demonstrating a level of trust that few white men had ever shown toward Native peoples. More importantly, he was accepting personal risk in service of principles that extended far beyond his own immediate interests or safety. "Chief Running Bear, Sarah Tall Eagle," Sam said with formal ceremony, "I accept your protection and your partnership in seeking justice. I am honored by your trust and committed to proving that cooperation between our peoples can achieve what neither could accomplish alone." The alliance forged in that moment would reshape not only the investigation of Blake's conspiracy, but the entire relationship between white and Apache communities throughout the New Mexico territory. Sam's willingness to trust Apache protection with his life would become the foundation for unprecedented cooperation that would challenge every assumption about racial relations on the American frontier. Sam Harrison's first night in the Apache encampment challenged every assumption he had formed about Native peoples during his months of academic study. The reality of Apache daily life bore little resemblance to the savage stereotypes promoted by territorial newspapers or the romanticized portrayals found in Eastern literature. Instead, Sam discovered a sophisticated society with its own forms of law, governance, and social organization that were perfectly adapted to the harsh realities of desert survival. The Apache camp was located in a hidden canyon 20 miles south of Cedar Ridge, protected by natural barriers that made it virtually invisible from the surrounding high desert. The location had been chosen not just for defensive purposes, but for its access to water, grazing areas, and the kind of natural resources that could support a community through extended periods of isolation from outside trade. Sarah, Tall Eagle, had assigned Sam a place in her own family section of the camp, a gesture that carried significant meaning within Apache social customs. By accepting responsibility for his safety and cultural education, she was essentially adopting him as a temporary member of her extended family group. This arrangement provided Sam with protection and legitimacy within the community, while also ensuring that his behavior would reflect on Sarah's own reputation and standing. The physical challenges of adapting to Apache life were immediate and humbling. Sam's custom-designed equipment and modified techniques that had served him well in ranching operations proved inadequate for the demands of desert survival and Apache mobility. Everything from his clothing to his sleeping arrangements required modification or complete replacement to function effectively in his new environment. Sarah approached these practical challenges with the same systematic intelligence that she brought to diplomatic negotiations. Rather than simply providing Sam with traditional Apache equipment that wouldn't suit his physical requirements, she worked with the camp's craftsmen to develop modified gear that would allow him to participate fully in community activities while accommodating his unique needs. Small Chief, Sarah explained as she demonstrated the use of a specially constructed saddle that would allow Sam to mount and control Apache horses. Our people believe that every person has gifts that benefit the community, but only if they are allowed to use those gifts in ways that honor their nature. We will help you find the ways that your nature can serve our common purposes. The philosophical framework underlying Sarah's approach to accommodation reflected broader Apache values about individual dignity and community responsibility that Sam found both surprising and admirable. Rather than expecting him to conform completely to existing customs or treating his physical differences as inherent limitations, the Apache community sought ways to integrate his capabilities into their collective activities. Sam's integration into Apache daily life provided him with insights into native perspectives on land use, resource management, and social organization that contradicted almost everything he had been taught about primitive peoples. The Apache economy was based on sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and seasonal cycles that maximize sustainable resource extraction while maintaining environmental balance across vast territories. More importantly, Sam observed governance systems that emphasize consensus building, individual autonomy, and collective responsibility in ways that challenged his assumptions about democracy and social justice. Apache councils made decisions through extended discussions that continued until all voices had been heard and acceptable compromises had been reached. No individual, regardless of their status or reputation, could impose their will on others without achieving genuine agreement through persuasion and mutual respect. These observations forced Sam to reconsider his understanding of American democratic institutions and their moral foundations. The Apache peoples, who were portrayed as savage obstacles to civilization, actually practiced forms of democracy that were more inclusive and representative than anything he had experienced in Philadelphia business circles or frontier community politics. But Sam's most significant education came through his developing relationship with Sarah Tall Eagle herself. Her intelligence, cultural knowledge, and political sophistication challenged every stereotype about Native women that Sam had absorbed from American popular culture. Sarah was not just an interpreter or ceremonial figure, but a strategic thinker, whose analysis of territorial politics and cultural dynamics was more sophisticated than that of most elected officials he had encountered. Sarah's personal history revealed the complexity of Apache experiences with American expansion and the individual struggles that lay behind broader patterns of cultural conflict. She had been educated by Presbyterian missionaries during her childhood, learning to read and write English while also mastering traditional Apache skills and knowledge. This dual education had made her uniquely qualified to serve as an intermediary between Apache and white communities, but it had also created personal conflicts about identity and loyalty that she continued to navigate. "I have seen the good and evil in both worlds," Sarah confided to Sam during one of their evening conversations about the investigation they were conducting together. "Your people have knowledge and tools that could benefit everyone, but you also have hungers that destroy everything you touch. My people have wisdom about living in harmony with the land and each other, but we sometimes resist changes that could help us survive in the world you have created." Sarah's willingness to share her personal perspectives on cultural conflict reflected the level of trust that was developing between them as they worked together on gathering evidence about Blake's conspiracy. Their collaboration was producing insights that neither could have achieved alone. Combining Sam's analytical skills and business knowledge with Sarah's understanding of Apache intelligence networks and territorial politics, the investigation itself was revealing the enormous scope of the conspiracy against Apache peoples throughout the region. Blake's false flag operations were part of a coordinated campaign that involved cattle theft, weapons sales to hostile tribes, deliberate treaty violations, and systematic misinformation designed to justify military action against peaceful Apache bands. The ultimate goal was to clear native peoples from territories that contained valuable mineral deposits and potential railroad routes. Sarah's contribution to documenting these crimes was invaluable because Apache scouts had been observing suspicious activities throughout the territory for months without understanding their connection to broader political objectives. Her people had detailed knowledge of who was involved in various illegal operations, when and where crimes had been committed, and how different incidents were related to each other. "Our warriors have been watching these white men for many moons," Sarah reported as she and Sam compiled their evidence. "We knew they were planning something that would bring trouble to our people, but we did not understand that they were willing to kill their own kind to achieve their purposes. This changes everything about how we must respond to their threats." The evidence they were gathering was so comprehensive and damaging that Sam began to worry about the safety of everyone involved in the investigation. Blake's consortium had demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their conspiracy, and the political figures involved had access to territorial, military resources that could be used to eliminate threats to their operations. Sam's concerns about security were validated when Apache scouts reported unusual military activity near territorial army posts, including the movement of troops and equipment that suggested preparation for major operations against native communities. Blake's exposure in Cedar Ridge had apparently accelerated his timeline for implementing the broader conspiracy, forcing him to rely on military action rather than continued deception to achieve his objectives. "Sarah," Sam said as they reviewed reports of military movements, "I think we may have pushed Blake into taking actions that will be more destructive than anything he originally planned. By exposing his conspiracy, we may have made the situation worse for your people rather than better." Sarah's response revealed both her understanding of the risks they faced and her commitment to seeing the investigation through to its conclusion. "Small chief, these evil men would have found excuses for their wars regardless of what we discovered about their lies. At least now our people know who our real enemies are and what they are trying to accomplish. Knowledge is always better than ignorance when facing an enemy who fights with deception." But Sarah's practical assessment of their situation included recognition that they needed more than just evidence to prevent the military campaign that Blake was orchestrating. They needed allies within the American political system who had the authority and motivation to intervene in territorial affairs before Blake's conspiracy achieved its objectives through force rather than deception. Dr. Whitman had been working to establish contact with federal officials in Washington who were concerned about territorial corruption and its impact on Indian policy. Her documentation of Blake's activities had attracted attention from bureaucrats and politicians who understood that systematic deception in territorial affairs could create national scandals that would damage careers and political reputations. Challenge was establishing communication with these potential allies quickly enough to prevent military action while ensuring that the evidence reached people who had both the authority and the motivation to act on it. The territorial telegraph system was controlled by interests allied with Blake's conspiracy, making secure communication with federal authorities virtually impossible through conventional channels. Sarah proposed a solution that would require unprecedented cooperation between Apache and white communities throughout the region. Apache communication networks, based on signal fires, mounted messengers, and other traditional methods, could deliver messages to federal authorities through routes that Blake's consortium couldn't monitor or intercept. Our people have ways of sending word to the Great Father's representatives that do not depend on the white man's talking wires, Sarah explained. But this will require trust between our peoples that has never existed before. Apache messengers would have to travel through white settlements, and white officials would have to believe messages delivered by native peoples rather than through their own government channels. The proposal represented exactly the kind of revolutionary cooperation that Sam had dreamed of achieving when he first arrived in Cedar Ridge, but it also required levels of mutual trust and cultural bridge building that seemed almost impossible given the immediate military threats they faced. Success would depend on both communities' willingness to abandon centuries of suspicion and hostility in favor of principled cooperation against common enemies. As Sam and Sarah prepared to implement their communication strategy, both understood that they were attempting something that could either prevent a catastrophic war or trigger the very conflict they were trying to avoid. The stakes had never been higher, and failure would mean not just personal disaster, but the destruction of everything they had worked to build together. The Apache communication network that Sarah had described to Sam proved to be far more sophisticated and extensive than he had imagined possible. Within hours of their decision to contact federal authorities, mounted messengers were carrying detailed documentation of Blake's conspiracy toward the territorial capital, while signal fires on distant mountain peaks relayed coded messages to Apache bands throughout the region. But the traditional communication methods that had served Apache peoples for generations faced unprecedented challenges when tasked with preventing an American military campaign. The messages needed to reach not just Apache communities, but sympathetic federal officials whose authority superseded territorial political figures allied with Blake's conspiracy. More critically, the evidence had to arrive before Blake could implement military solutions to the problems created by his exposure in Cedar Ridge. Sarah's role in coordinating this communication effort revealed capabilities that impressed even Sam, who had already developed enormous respect for her intelligence and organizational skills. She served as the central node in a network that extended across hundreds of miles, maintaining contact with dozens of different Apache bands while simultaneously managing the complex logistics of moving evidence through hostile territory. "Small chief," Sarah explained as she reviewed reports from messengers who had been traveling for 2 days without rest. "Our people have carried word of Blake's crimes to the agent at Fort Sumner, the territorial secretary in Santa Fe, and the Indian Bureau representatives in Albuquerque. But the responses we are receiving suggest that some of these officials may be part of the conspiracy themselves." The revelation that Blake's corruption extended to federal Indian agents and territorial administrators forced Sam to confront the possibility that their evidence might be suppressed rather than investigated. The conspiracy they had uncovered was not just a local business scheme, but part of systematic corruption that involved officials whose job was supposedly to protect native peoples from exactly this kind of exploitation and violence. Sam's analysis of the political situation suggested that their only hope lay in reaching officials in Washington whose careers depended on maintaining federal authority over territorial affairs. Territorial corruption scandals could destroy political reputations and end promising careers, creating incentives for federal intervention that transcended the local interests. Protecting Blake's conspiracy. Dr. Whitman, who had remained in Cedar Ridge to coordinate with federal contacts through conventional telegraph channels, sent word through Apache messengers that she had succeeded in establishing communication with officials in the Interior Department who were already investigating territorial irregularities. Her documentation of Blake's activities had provided federal investigators with evidence they needed to justify intervention in territorial affairs. But even this success came with sobering news about the timeline they faced. Federal investigators needed additional time to build legal cases that could withstand political pressure from Blake's allies in territorial government. Military intervention. To prevent Blake's planned campaign against Apache territories would require evidence so overwhelming that no political figure could risk being associated with protecting the conspiracy. Meanwhile, territorial military preparations were accelerating at a pace that suggested Blake had abandoned subtlety in favor of immediate action. Apache scouts reported cavalry units moving toward positions that would allow rapid deployment against tribal territories, while supply convoys carried ammunition and equipment sufficient for extended military operations. The race between their investigation and Blake's military timeline created pressure that tested every aspect of the unprecedented cooperation between Apache and white communities. Traditional enemies were being forced to trust each other with their lives and their futures while working under conditions that allowed no margin for error or miscommunication. Sam's position within this crisis was particularly precarious because his safety depended entirely on Apache protection, while his credibility with federal authorities required maintaining his identity as a white businessman with legitimate standing in territorial affairs. He was simultaneously an insider and outsider in both communities, trusted by neither but essential to both. The personal strain of this impossible position was compounded by his growing awareness that his relationship with Sarah had evolved beyond professional cooperation into something deeper and more complex. Their collaboration had created emotional bonds that transcended the cultural barriers separating their peoples, but it had also highlighted the enormous obstacles to any permanent relationship between them. Sarah's awareness of these developing feelings was evident in her increasing protectiveness toward Sam and her efforts to shield him from the more dangerous aspects of their investigation. But she also understood that their personal relationship, regardless of its nature, would be scrutinized and potentially used against them by enemies who viewed any cooperation between Apache and white peoples as threatening to their interests. "Small chief," Sarah said during one of their private conversations about the investigation's progress, "you must understand that our enemies will use our friendship against both of us if they discover how much we have come to trust and respect each other. There are those among both our peoples who believe that such friendship is impossible or dangerous." Sarah's warning proved prophetic when word reached the Apache camp that Morrison had escaped from custody in Cedar Ridge and was reportedly traveling toward territorial military installations with information about Sam's cooperation with Apache peoples. Morrison's betrayal transformed their investigation from a pursuit of justice into a desperate race for survival. Morrison's escape had been facilitated by Blake's agents, who understood that his testimony about Sam's collaboration with hostile tribes could be used to justify military action regardless of the evidence that Sam and Sarah had gathered about the conspiracy. In the political climate of territorial expansion, accusations of white men cooperating with native peoples carried enormous weight with military commanders and political officials. The Apache response to this threat demonstrated both their military capabilities and their commitment to protecting Sam, despite the risks it created for their own people. Chief Running Bear authorized the deployment of veteran warriors to establish defensive positions around the hidden canyon while maintaining communication with other Apache bans about coordinated responses to potential military action, but the most significant response came from Sarah herself, who proposed a strategy that would either vindicate their investigation or destroy them both. Rather than waiting for federal authorities to act on their evidence or for Blake's military campaign to begin, she suggested that they take their documentation directly to the territorial military commander whose troops were being positioned for action against Apache peoples. If we can convince Colonel Marcus Thornton that he is being used to commit crimes rather than maintain order, Sarah argued, then Blake's military option disappears and the conspiracy collapses. But if we fail to persuade him, then we place ourselves entirely at the mercy of the very forces we have been fighting. Colonel Thornton's reputation was that of a professional soldier who took pride in conducting military operations according to legal and ethical standards. Unlike many territorial military commanders, he had consistently refused to participate in unofficial actions against native peoples and had publicly criticized policies that he viewed as violations of federal treaty obligations. Sam's assessment was that Thornton represented their best hope for preventing Blake's military campaign, but approaching him would require leaving the safety of Apache protection and placing themselves in a situation where they could be arrested or eliminated before presenting their evidence. The risk was enormous, but the alternative was waiting for federal intervention that might arrive too late to prevent catastrophic violence. Sarah's willingness to accompany Sam on this mission represented a level of personal commitment that went far beyond her official responsibilities as an Apache diplomat. By placing herself in American military custody, she would be abandoning the protection of her own people while trusting that Sam's evidence and Thornton's integrity would prevent her from being treated as a prisoner of war. Their decision to approach Colonel Thornton together created a precedent for Apache-white cooperation that was unprecedented in territorial history. Never before had Apache leaders voluntarily placed themselves under American military authority for the purpose of preventing conflict rather than negotiating surrender or prisoner exchanges. The journey from the hidden canyon to the military installation at Fort Craig required traveling through territory controlled by Blake's agents and territorial officials who had orders to prevent Sam and Sarah from reaching federal authorities. Apache scouts provided intelligence about patrol patterns and safe routes, but the final approach to the fort would require passing through areas where they could not be protected. Sam and Sarah's relationship had evolved during their weeks of collaboration into something that neither fully understood, but both recognized as profound and transformative. Their different backgrounds, cultures, and physical appearances had initially seemed like insurmountable barriers, but their shared commitment to justice and their complementary capabilities had created bonds that transcended conventional social categories. As they prepared to ride toward what might be their final confrontation with Blake's conspiracy, both understood that their mission represented more than just an attempt to prevent military action against Apache peoples. They were demonstrating that cooperation between very different kinds of people could achieve things that neither could accomplish alone, and that justice was worth risking everything to achieve. The ride toward Fort Craig would test not only their courage and their evidence, but their faith in the possibility that truth and moral clarity could triumph over deception and systematic injustice. The stakes could not have been higher, and failure would mean not just personal destruction, but the triumph of forces that viewed both native peoples and principled white allies as obstacles to be eliminated rather than citizens deserving protection under American law. The sight of Sam Harrison and Sarah Tall Eagle approaching Fort Craig under a white flag created the kind of sensation that would be discussed in military circles for decades to come. Never in the history of territorial conflicts had an Apache diplomat and a white civilian voluntarily placed themselves under military authority for the purpose of preventing rather than negotiating the aftermath of warfare. Colonel Marcus Thornton received word of their approach while reviewing deployment orders that would position his cavalry units for major operations against Apache territories throughout the region. The timing of their arrival, just hours before he was scheduled to begin military actions based on reports of Apache raids and treaty violations, created a situation that challenged everything he thought he understood about the current crisis. Thornton was a career military officer whose reputation had been built on careful adherence to legal protocols and ethical standards that many of his territorial contemporaries considered overly restrictive. His refusal to participate in unofficial actions against native peoples had earned him respect from federal authorities, while creating tensions with territorial officials who preferred commanders willing to interpret their orders liberally. The colonel's initial reaction to Sam and Sarah's request for an audience was complicated by the intelligence reports he had received about their activities. Morrison's testimony, delivered just hours earlier, had portrayed Sam as a traitor who had been providing Apache bands with information about military deployments and ranching operations. According to Morrison's account, Sam's cooperation with tribal leaders represented a security threat that justified immediate arrest and potential charges of treason. But Thornton's military experience had taught him to evaluate intelligence reports critically, particularly when they came from sources whose motives might be questionable. Morrison's obvious emotional instability and his financial connections to interests that would benefit from military action against Apache peoples raised questions about the reliability of his accusations against Sam. More significantly, Thornton had been receiving conflicting reports from federal authorities about territorial political corruption and its impact on military operations. Word from Washington suggested that some territorial officials were manipulating military deployments to serve private interests rather than legitimate security concerns. The colonel was beginning to suspect that his current orders might be based on manufactured rather than genuine threats. Sam and Sarah's meeting with Colonel Thornton took place in the fort's conference room, where they were flanked by armed guards, but accorded the formal courtesies due to diplomatic representatives. The colonel's willingness to meet with them at all, despite Morrison's accusations, suggested that he retained enough independence from territorial political pressures to consider evidence that contradicted official narratives. Mr. Harrison. Miss Tall Eagle, Colonel Thornton began with formal military precision. I have been informed that you possess information relevant to my current operational orders. I am prepared to listen to what you have to say, but I must warn you that any attempts to interfere with legitimate military operations will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. Sam's response was delivered with the same careful analysis that had characterized his business presentations, but with awareness that the stakes now included not just economic success, but the prevention of regional warfare and the lives of hundreds of people on both sides of the cultural divide. Colonel Thornton, Sam said as he arranged the extensive documentation they had gathered, we are here to present evidence that your current operational orders are based on manufactured incidents designed to justify military action that serves private interests rather than legitimate security concerns. The Apache raids that have been reported to you either never occurred or were carried out by white agents, provocateurs, seeking to trigger exactly the kind of military response you are being ordered to undertake. The accusation was so serious that Thornton's military training required him to evaluate it carefully despite his initial skepticism. False flag operations designed to justify military action represented violations of federal law that could destroy careers and result in criminal prosecution for anyone involved, including military commanders who participated unknowingly in such schemes. Sarah's contribution to their presentation was equally methodical, but approached from perspectives that Thornton had never encountered in previous intelligence briefings. Her detailed knowledge of Apache tribal politics, communication networks, and military capabilities provided insights that contradicted fundamental assumptions underlying the Colonel's operational orders. "Colonel," Sarah said with a dignified authority that had made her an effective diplomatic representative, "my people have been watching the activities of those who seek to make war between us. We know which white men have been stealing cattle and weapons while wearing Apache clothing. We know which officials have been paid to provide false reports about tribal hostilities. We know the locations where stolen goods have been hidden and the names of men who have participated in these deceptions." Sarah's offer to provide specific intelligence about the conspiracy's operations presented Thornton with information that could either vindicate or expose his current military mission. If her claims were accurate, then proceeding with his orders would make him complicit in crimes against both Apache peoples and American justice. If her claims were false, then delaying military action based on her testimony could allow genuine threats to escape punishment while undermining military authority throughout the territory. The documentation that Sam and Sarah presented included financial records, witness testimony, and physical evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of Blake's conspiracy and its connections to territorial political figures. More importantly, their evidence included specific predictions about future false flag operations that could be verified through military intelligence before irreversible actions were taken. "Colonel," Sam explained as he reviewed the financial documentation, "Carson Blake's consortium has been systematically creating incidents designed to justify military intervention that will clear Apache peoples from territories containing valuable mineral deposits and potential railroads. The raids attributed to Apache bands have been carefully staged to maximize political impact while minimizing actual damage to property that Blake's allies intend to claim for themselves." Thornton's examination of their evidence was thorough and professional, reflecting years of experience evaluating intelligence reports under conditions where mistakes could cost lives and careers. The documentation they provided was more comprehensive than anything he had received from territorial officials, and its internal consistency suggested either genuine authenticity or a level of sophistication that seemed unlikely for a deception operation. But the Colonel's most significant concern was verification of their claims through independent sources that were not connected to either the conspiracy they were exposing or the Apache communities that would benefit from preventing military action. Military decisions required evidence that could withstand scrutiny from superior officers and political officials who might have their own agendas. "Mr. Harrison, Miss Tall Eagle," Thornton said after reviewing their documentation for several hours, "the evidence you have presented raises serious questions about my current orders, but I cannot simply halt military operations based on allegations from sources that have obvious interests in preventing such action. I need independent verification of your claims before I can justify delaying deployments that have been authorized by territorial and federal authorities." Sam's response revealed the depth of preparation that had gone into their approach to the Colonel. Rather than simply presenting accusations and demanding immediate action, they had anticipated the need for verification and had prepared methods for testing their claims through military intelligence assets that were independent of both the conspiracy and Apache information networks. "Colonel," Sam said, "we can provide you with specific locations where stolen cattle and equipment are currently being held by Blake's agents. Your scouts can verify these locations and observe the men guarding them without revealing their presence or compromising your operational security. More importantly, we can predict exactly where and when the next false flag operation is scheduled to occur, allowing you to position observers who can document the true nature of these allegedly Apache raids." The offer to provide testable predictions represented exactly the kind of verification that Thornton needed to justify delaying military action while investigating their claims. If Sam and Sarah's information proved accurate, it would vindicate their accusations while providing evidence that could be used to prosecute the conspiracy. If their predictions proved false, it would discredit their entire testimony while confirming the legitimacy of his original orders. Sarah's contribution to this verification process was her offer to provide Apache scouts who would guide military observers to locations where they could witness Blake's operations without being detected. This unprecedented offer of Apache assistance to American military intelligence represented a level of cooperation that had never existed in territorial history. "Colonel Thornton," Sarah said with formal ceremony, "my people are willing to place their most skilled scouts under your temporary command to help you discover the truth about these crimes. We ask only that you judge our words by the evidence your own eyes will see, not by the prejudices that others have taught you about our character." The colonel's decision to accept their offer for independent verification represented a turning point in territorial military policy toward native peoples. For the first time, Apache intelligence was being formally integrated into American military operations for the purpose of preventing rather than conducting warfare. But Thornton's agreement to investigate their claims also created new dangers for everyone involved. Blake's consortium had demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their conspiracy, and the involvement of military intelligence in exposing their operations would force them to escalate their tactics or face complete destruction of their enterprise. As Colonel Thornton prepared to deploy scouts to verify Sam and Sarah's claims, all three understood that they had committed themselves to a course of action that would either vindicate their faith in American justice or destroy them all in the process of exposing systematic corruption that extended to the highest levels of territorial government. The joint Apache-American scouting mission that departed Fort Craig before dawn represented the most unprecedented military cooperation in the history of territorial conflicts. Sergeant William McKenna, a veteran cavalry scout with 15 years of frontier experience, found himself following Apache warrior Joseph Crow feather through terrain that he had never successfully navigated. Despite years of attempted patrols in the region, Colonel Thornton had selected McKenna for this mission specifically because of his reputation for accurate reporting and his lack of connections to territorial political interests that might influence his observations. The sergeant's credibility with military authorities was unquestioned, making his testimony about Blake's operations crucial to any legal or military action that might follow their investigation. The first verification target was a hidden canyon 20 miles northeast of Fort Craig, where Sam and Sarah claimed Blake's agents were holding stolen cattle while preparing them for transport to buyers in Colorado. According to their intelligence, the operation was guarded by men whose military bearing and equipment suggested professional experience rather than simple criminal activity. Crow Feather's guidance through the rugged terrain revealed capabilities that impressed even McKenna, whose own scouting skills were legendary among territorial cavalry units. The Apache warrior moved through landscape that appeared impassable to white eyes, following routes that provided concealment while maintaining visual contact with their destination. "Sergeant," Crow Feather whispered as they approached a ridge overlooking the canyon where the stolen cattle were allegedly being held, "your small chief spoke truth about these men. Look carefully at their horses, their weapons, and the way they position themselves for guard duty. These are not ordinary cattle thieves." McKenna's examination of the canyon through his field glasses confirmed details that were impossible to dismiss or rationalize away. The men guarding the stolen cattle were indeed professionals, armed with military-issue carbines and equipped with cavalry gear that would have been difficult for civilian criminals to acquire. More significantly, their defensive positions and patrol patterns reflected military training that ordinary ranch hands or cattle rustlers would not possess. The cattle themselves bore brands from multiple ranches throughout the Cedar Ridge region, including Morrison's distinctive double M mark on several head of prime breeding stock. The animals were being held in temporary corrals that could be quickly dismantled, while supply wagons suggested preparation for immediate transport to distant markets, where questions about ownership would be unlikely. But McKenna's most damaging observation concerned the identity of the operations supervisor, whom he recognized as Marcus Webb, a former cavalry officer who had been cashiered from military service for corruption involving Army supply contracts. Webb's presence confirmed that Blake's operations involved experienced personnel with military backgrounds and connections to territorial political networks. "Crowfeather," McKenna said quietly as they documented the canyon operations, "your information has been completely accurate so far. If the rest of Small Chief's predictions prove equally reliable, then we're looking at conspiracy that goes far beyond simple cattle theft." The second verification target was even more significant, a planned false flag operation that Sam and Sarah had predicted would occur at the Richardson Ranch on the morning they were conducting their investigation. According to their intelligence, Blake's agents would stage another Apache raid designed to justify immediate military action while eliminating witnesses who might contradict official accounts of tribal hostility. McKenna and Crowfeather's approach to the Richardson Ranch required extreme stealth because the false flag operation was scheduled to begin before sunrise, when visibility would be limited and any observers could be eliminated without creating complications for the staged attack. Their position needed to provide clear observation of events while ensuring their own safety in case the operation included provisions for killing potential witnesses. The Apache warriors' knowledge of the terrain surrounding Richardson's ranch proved invaluable for establishing observation posts that were invisible to the raiders, while providing clear lines of sight to the ranch buildings. Crowfeather had apparently scouted this location previously, anticipating the need for exactly this kind of surveillance mission. As dawn approached, McKenna observed movement in the hills surrounding the Richardson Ranch that confirmed Sam and Sarah's predictions with devastating accuracy. Armed men wearing Apache clothing, but moving with military precision, were positioning themselves for coordinated assault on the ranch buildings. Their equipment, tactics, and coordination left no doubt that this was a professional military operation rather than genuine tribal raiding. "Sergeant," Crowfeather observed as they watched the false flag operation unfold, "notice how these false Apache carry their weapons and approach the buildings. Real Apache warriors would never attack in such formation or at such time of day. These men learned war from your army, not from our chiefs." McKenna's documentation of the false flag operation provided irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy that Sam and Sarah had exposed. Through his field glasses, he could identify several of the raiders as men he had encountered during previous military operations, including former soldiers whose dismissal from service had been related to disciplinary problems or criminal activity. Attack on Richardson's ranch was executed with theatrical precision designed to create maximum visual impact for any observers while minimizing actual damage to property that Blake's consortium intended to claim. The raiders killed Richardson's livestock and set fire to outbuildings, but avoided destroying the main house or facilities that would be valuable for future ranching operations. Most significantly, the raiders made no attempt to take prisoners or gather intelligence about military deployments, objectives that would have been priorities for genuine Apache war parties. Their actions were clearly designed to create evidence of tribal hostility rather than achieve tactical military advantages. The false flag operation concluded with the raiders departing toward Apache territories while leaving obvious trail markers that would lead any pursuing cavalry directly toward tribal lands. The entire performance was designed to justify military retaliation, while providing territorial officials with evidence they could present to federal authorities as proof of Apache aggression. McKenna's return to Fort Craig with documented proof of Blake's conspiracy created immediate crisis within territorial military and political establishments. The sergeant's testimony, supported by physical evidence and corroborated by Apache intelligence, provided Colonel Thornton with justification for halting military operations, while demanding investigation of the officials who had ordered action. Based on manufactured evidence, but Blake's response to his exposure demonstrated the scope of resources and political connections that his consortium possessed. Rather than attempting to deny the evidence that McKenna had gathered, Blake's allies in territorial government began implementing contingency plans designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy documentation before federal investigators could arrive. Word reached Fort Craig that federal marshals dispatched from Washington had been ambushed while traveling through territory controlled by officials allied with Blake's conspiracy. Dr. Whitman, who had remained in Cedar Ridge to coordinate with federal authorities, sent urgent messages warning that local officials were preparing to arrest anyone connected to exposing the conspiracy. The escalation of Blake's response forced Colonel Thornton to make decisions that exceeded his military authority, while potentially violating orders from territorial officials whose legitimacy was now questionable. The evidence provided by Sam and Sarah's investigation suggested that continuing to follow territorial directives would make him complicit in systematic criminal conspiracy, but taking independent action could result in charges of insubordination or mutiny. Sarah's analysis of the political situation provided insights that helped Thornton understand his options within the complex framework of federal, territorial, and tribal authority that governed frontier military operations. Her knowledge of legal precedents and political relationships had been enhanced by her collaboration with Sam and Dr. Whitman, creating expertise that exceeded what most military commanders could access. "Colonel," Sarah explained during their strategy session, "federal law gives you authority to protect witnesses and evidence when territorial officials are suspected of criminal conspiracy. Your duty to federal authorities supersedes orders from territorial officials whose legitimacy is compromised by their participation in crimes against both white and Apache peoples." Sam's contribution to their strategic planning was his analysis of Blake's financial vulnerabilities and business relationships that could be disrupted through military action that would appear legitimate even to Blake's political allies. The consortium's operations depended on transportation networks and supply lines that were subject to military interdiction for security reasons. "Colonel," Sam proposed, "if you establish security cordons around the areas where Blake is operating stolen cattle and staging false flag operations, you can justify such action as protection of civilian ranchers from Apache raids. Blake's agents will be unable to continue their operations without revealing their true nature to your soldiers." The strategy session between Thornton, Sam, and Sarah produced a coordinated response plan that would use military authority to protect evidence and witnesses while federal investigators worked to build legal cases against the conspiracy. More importantly, their plan would demonstrate that cooperation between Apache and American authorities could achieve justice more effectively than military action based on deception and cultural hatred. But implementing their plan would require unprecedented trust between military commanders and Apache leaders whose peoples had been enemies for generations. Success would depend on both communities' willingness to abandon traditional hostilities in favor of principled cooperation against common enemies who threatened the legitimate interests of both. As Colonel Thornton prepared to implement security measures that would protect the investigation while exposing Blake's conspiracy, all three understood that their actions would either vindicate their faith in justice or trigger escalated violence that could destroy everything they had worked to build together. The confrontation that would reshape the history of Apache-white relations in the New Mexico Territory began at dawn on a crisp November morning when 400 Apache warriors emerged from the desert hills surrounding Cedar Ridge. But these were not warriors approaching for battle. They came in response to Sarah Eagle's unprecedented call for a gathering that would demonstrate the true power of unified Apache peoples when they chose cooperation over conflict. Chief Running Bear rode at the head of this historic assembly, accompanied by leaders from 17 different Apache bands who had never before agreed to coordinate their actions in support of a single objective. The sight of so many Apache peoples moving together sent shockwaves through every white settlement in the territory. But their purpose was not conquest or revenge, it was justice. Sam Harrison stood beside Sarah Tall Eagle on a ridge overlooking Cedar Ridge, watching the most extraordinary sight of his life unfold in the valley below. The woman whose intelligence and courage had transformed his understanding of what was possible between different peoples now commanded the respect and loyalty of Apache nations whose combined military power could have swept every white settlement from the territory. "Small chief," Sarah said with quiet pride as she observed the disciplined movement of Apache warriors responding to her summons. "Today my people will show yours that we choose to be allies in justice rather than enemies in war. But this choice requires equal commitment from your people to honor the promises that will be made." The gathering in Cedar Ridge represented the culmination of months of diplomatic preparation that Sarah had been conducting through Apache communication networks while simultaneously working with Sam to expose Blake's conspiracy. Her ability to unite traditionally independent Apache bands behind a common cause demonstrated leadership capabilities that exceeded anything territorial officials had imagined possible. Colonel Thornton's cavalry units had taken positions around Cedar Ridge, but not as adversaries to the Apache gathering. Following the strategy developed during their alliance with Sam and Sarah, the military forces were present to protect the historic diplomatic meeting from interference by Blake's remaining agents and their territorial political allies. The colonel himself rode forward to meet Chief Running Bear in a formal ceremony that acknowledged Apache sovereignty while establishing mutual respect between military commanders who had spent their careers as enemies. The sight of American cavalry officers dismounting to show respect to Apache chiefs created precedents that would influence territorial policy for generations to come. "Chief Running Bear," Colonel Thornton announced with military ceremony, "I come as representative of the United States Army to acknowledge the justice of your cause and the integrity of your people in exposing crimes committed against both our communities. The evidence provided by your diplomats has proven that those who sought to make war between us are enemies of justice for all peoples." Blake's final desperate attempt to salvage his conspiracy came as the diplomatic ceremony was beginning. A group of heavily armed men, including territorial officials who had been part of the conspiracy, approached Cedar Ridge with the apparent intention of arresting Sam, Sarah, and anyone else connected to exposing their operations, but Blake had underestimated both the military protection provided by Colonel Thornton's forces and the defensive capabilities of 400 Apache warriors who had positioned themselves to protect the diplomatic gathering. When Blake's men attempted to force their way into the ceremony, they found themselves surrounded by a coalition that made resistance futile. Morrison, who had been traveling with Blake's group as a witness to support their version of events, found himself face to face with the Apache peoples he'd helped blame for crimes they had never committed. The contrast between his false accusations and the dignified reality of Apache leadership became impossible for anyone to ignore. "Tom Morrison," Chief Running Bear said with the kind of moral authority that comes from absolute certainty about right and wrong, "you participated in crimes against our peoples and then blamed us for violence that you helped to create. Today you will learn the difference between Apache justice and Apache mercy." But the Apache response to Morrison's betrayal demonstrated exactly the kind of principled leadership that Sam and Sarah had been advocating throughout their investigation. Instead of demanding punishment that would mirror the violence Morrison had helped to orchestrate, Chief Running Bear offered him an opportunity for redemption through public confession and commitment to making amends for the harm he had caused. The ceremony that followed transformed Cedar Ridge from a frontier settlement divided by racial hostility into a model for cooperation that would be studied and emulated throughout the American West. Sam's role in facilitating this transformation was formally acknowledged by both Apache leaders and military authorities, whose respect transcended any consideration of his unusual physical appearance. Sarah Tall Eagle's moment of greatest triumph came when she addressed the gathered Apache warriors, white settlers, and military personnel in a speech that articulated a vision of justice and mutual respect that inspired everyone who heard it. Her extraordinary height allowed her to be seen and heard by the entire assembly, as she spoke in both Apache and English about the possibilities that cooperation could create. My people and Small Chief's people have been taught to fear and hate each other by those who profit from our conflicts, Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the valley with perfect clarity. But we have learned that our strength lies not in destroying each other, but in working together to prevent those who would destroy us both from achieving their evil purposes. The climactic moment that gave meaning to everything Sam and Sarah had accomplished together came when Chief Running Bear formally invited Sam to join the Apache delegation as an adopted member of Sarah's clan. The ceremony that followed was unprecedented in territorial history, a white man being formally accepted into Apache society, not as a prisoner or curioser, but as an equal partner in building a better future for all peoples. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Sarah, in front of the entire assembled crowd of Apache warriors, white settlers, and military personnel, lifted Sam onto the back of a magnificent Apache stallion, demonstrating that leadership was defined by character and capability rather than physical appearance or cultural background. The sight of the tallest Apache woman lifting the shortest white man in the territory while 400 Apache warriors bowed their heads in respect created an image that would be remembered and retold throughout the American West. It represented the triumph of justice over prejudice, cooperation over conflict, and individual worth over social convention. Blake's final arrest by federal marshals who had finally reached the territory provided a satisfying conclusion to the conspiracy that had threatened to destroy both communities. The evidence gathered by Sam and Sarah's investigation resulted in convictions that extended throughout territorial government, while establishing legal precedents for protecting Native peoples from false flag operations and systematic deception. Dr. Whitman's documentation of the conspiracy became the foundation for federal investigations that exposed similar schemes throughout the Western territories, leading to reforms that protected both Native and white communities from exploitation by interests that viewed human lives as expendable resources in pursuit of profit and political power. The long-term impact of Sam and Sarah's partnership extended far beyond the immediate resolution of Blake's conspiracy. Their success in preventing military conflict while exposing systematic corruption demonstrated that individuals from very different backgrounds could achieve extraordinary things when they combined their unique capabilities in service of shared principles. The Cedar Ridge Cooperative Sam had originally established became the model for similar organizations throughout the territory, providing economic opportunities that benefited both white and Apache communities while creating relationships that made future conflicts less likely. Sam's innovative approaches to ranching and resource management were adopted throughout the region, improving prosperity for everyone involved. Sarah's role in facilitating Apache-white cooperation made her one of the most influential diplomatic figures in territorial history. Her success in uniting traditionally independent Apache bands behind common causes established her as a leader whose influence extended far beyond her own people, while her partnership with Sam demonstrated that cultural differences could be bridges rather than barriers to mutual understanding. The personal relationship that had developed between Sam and Sarah during their collaboration evolved into a marriage that challenged every social convention of their era while demonstrating that love could transcend any barrier that prejudice and fear might create. Their wedding ceremony, conducted according to both Apache and Christian traditions, was attended by representatives from 17 Apache bands and officials from territorial government, creating precedents that influence territorial policy. Toward interracial relationships, their children grew up understanding that their mixed heritage was a source of strength rather than confusion, that they belonged to both worlds while being limited by neither. The family they created together became a symbol of the possibilities that opened when people chose cooperation over conflict and love over fear. The legacy of Sam Harrison and Sarah Tall Eagle's partnership continued to influence territorial and eventually state policy for generations after their initial collaboration in exposing Blake's conspiracy. The legal precedents established through their investigation protected Native communities throughout the American West from similar schemes, while the cooperative institutions they created provided models for economic and social relationships that transcended racial and cultural divisions. But perhaps their most important legacy was the demonstration that extraordinary achievements were possible when people combined their different strengths in service of justice and mutual respect. The short white rancher and the tall Apache diplomat had proven that the barriers separating peoples were artificial constructions that could be overcome by those with sufficient courage and determination to try. Their story became legend throughout the American West, inspiring others to seek cooperation rather than conflict, justice rather than convenience, and love rather than fear in their relationships with peoples different from themselves. The moment when Sarah lifted Sam onto horseback while Apache warriors bowed in respect became a symbol of the transformation that was possible when human beings chose to honor the best rather than the worst aspects of their nature. In the end, Sam Harrison and Sarah Tall Eagle had achieved something far greater than personal success or individual happiness. They had demonstrated that the American dream of equality and justice was achievable not just for those who fit conventional expectations, but for anyone willing to work toward creating a society worthy of its highest ideals. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,